Our next presenter will be Mandy Gleist. Her topic is that digitally altered advertisements should be regulated.
Sorry. Okay, so everyone has seen the cartoon depictions of an angel and a demon on the shoulders. The angel telling the person what is good and what is right, and then the demon attempting to convince the person struggling that these really destructive things are actually what is good for them. Well, an eating disorder is just like the voice of the little demon on the shoulder, constantly trying to deceive the person who's struggling into believing that doing harmful things, such as starving themselves, is actually what's good for them. And our society today has produced a beauty standard that empowers that voice. And as a result of that, we are seeing a number of 119% increase of adolescents hospitalized due to an eating disorder. And so in an attempt to reduce this number and to stop this upward trend in its track, I am arguing that our society, the US, needs to regulate digitally altered advertisements. These advertisements are produced by the companies where they alter the model's body shapes and sizes. So you might be wondering, what is wrong with our current standard? Well, our standard today promotes being unhealthily thin. The companies that produce these advertisements are altering the images of the models, changing their body shapes, doing things that are included but not limited to shrinking of their waists, and then the slimming and lengthening of their legs. By doing so, if these models had that actual body in real life, they would be deemed as underweight. And so, as the companies produce these advertisements, they are setting this standard that idolizes an unhealthy thinness. By doing so, they are increasing the body dissatisfaction in the consumers, which directly affects the rate of eating disorders we are seeing. And this standard also triggers comparison. So the social comparison theory was crafted by Leon Festinger, and it states that people, by nature, naturally compare themselves to whatever standard they are given. And so, as these companies are producing this standard that idolizes thinness, these people adopt that standard into their brains and they use that standard to improve themselves. As they see this standard way over here idolizing thinness in an unhealthy rate too, and the body of the average healthy consumer is over here, this large gap, that is what the consumers will deem as needing improvement. And that improvement that they do most commonly by unhealthy means. This can include things such as starving oneself and purging. Purging is defined as the acts used in an attempt to reverse the effects of eating, included but not limited to making oneself throw up, abusing the use of laxatives, and excessive exercising. All of these harmful behaviors can lead to a full-blown eating disorder. And so when that gap is that large, by the standard being way over here in an unhealthy thinness, and the healthy consumers as the average body here, as that gap is that big, that is the space that allows for body dissatisfaction. And so you might be questioning, why is body dissatisfaction a problem? Well, body dissatisfaction is actually the leading cause of eating disorders. It plays a role in every single eating disorder developed and is the main cause for a majority of them. There are several other causes, but body dissatisfaction is the biggest one. And so, as the consumers attempt to shrink that gap and move closer to that standard, they do so by unhealthy means, often developing an eating disorder. But what actually needs to happen is that standard needs to be moved closer to the consumers, shrinking that gap and avoiding harm to the consumers. And so as the companies are producing this standard, they are misleading the consumers. They are misleading the consumers because they are being dishonest with them about the model's actual body shapes and sizes. They are exaggerating the features of already thin models, making them unhealthily thin, and claiming that that is what is beautiful. And so by doing so, they are misleading the consumers. So one question that people would ask is, why can't you just put a disclaimer on the advertisements? Well, in theory, that would be a perfect solution. But sadly, it is not. There's this thing called the boomerang effect. And so when you put a disclaimer on these altered advertisements, it doesn't change the standard. What we want is that standard to move closer to the consumers. But when we put a disclaimer on the advertisements, we keep the standard over there. We keep that gap open, and we just draw attention to the standard. By putting a disclaimer on the advertisements, we are just intensifying the effects of the standard. The boomerang effect is defined as the opposite effect of what we want. And so there's actually been multiple studies done that have shown that when you put a disclaimer on these advertisements, the effects of body dissatisfaction are actually worsened. There's a larger increase of body dissatisfaction, which would grow that gap. And when body dissatisfaction increases, so does eating disorder rates. There is a direct tie between the two. And so if putting disclaimers on the advertisements would shrink that gap, it would be a perfect solution. But sadly, it doesn't. So another question about the regulation of these advertisements would be the constitutionality of them. There was one Supreme Court case with a company called Central Hudson Gas and Electric. One thing that many people don't understand is that the freedom of speech laws differ between individuals and companies. People would say, wouldn't the regulation of these advertisements go against the freedom of speech of the companies? But like I said, the laws differ between individuals and companies. And so as a result of that Supreme Court case, they developed a 4-phase test called the Central Hudson test. The first phase of that test claims that the speech in question must be misleading. And as I have already said, the advertisements that they are producing are being dishonest with the consumers and misleading them into thinking that they need to shrink that gap by doing unhealthy things to themselves. And so it passed that first phase of the test. And then the second phase of this test is that the regulation must support a substantial governmental interest. And as I mentioned in the very beginning, there's a 119% increase of just adolescents being hospitalized due to an eating disorder. Right now in the United States, we're facing numbers of upwards of 30 million eating disorders. And that number right there, 30 million, that does not encompass all of the individuals who are equally struggling but are undiagnosed. And so clearly, we need to do something about these frightening numbers. So there is definitely a substantial interest. Then the third phase of this test is that the regulation must directly advance that interest. So as I said, eating disorders that are developed are caused largely by body dissatisfaction. And that standard being way over here, that gap, that is what causes body dissatisfaction. There is a direct correlation between body dissatisfaction and eating disorders, and then the standard and body dissatisfaction. So by shrinking body dissatisfaction, we are shrinking the amount of eating disorders produced, directly advancing towards that interest. So then the fourth and final stage of this test is that the regulation must not be more extensive than necessary. These regulations would only occur to advertisements that alter models' body shapes and sizes. This would not include advertisements that do things such as removing blemishes or smoothing skin. This is solely for advertisements that alter the model's body shapes and sizes. And so by doing so, we are targeting what we need to get the effects that we need, while also staying within the bounds of necessity. And so, how does this line up with the Bible? Well, in Mark 12:31, it says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." If we are not actively going against this standard, we are allowing it to take place. And by knowing the effects of this standard and not doing anything about it, we are inadvertently supporting this standard. And if we know what it can cause to our neighbors by allowing that standard to take place, we are not loving our neighbors to the best of our ability as God calls us to do. Genesis 1:27 says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them." If we are inadvertently supporting this standard, we are going directly against what the Bible says. We are called to tell everyone about the news in the Bible. And it starts early in Genesis by saying, God created man in his own image. We need to tell everyone, because every single person on this earth was created perfectly in God's image. And when we are supporting that standard, we are supporting the idea that they need to look like this very specific image in order to be deemed as beautiful. That goes directly against the Bible. And so, in order to stay in line with what God calls us to do, we need to love everybody and spread the word that they are made perfectly in God's image, which we cannot do when we are supporting that standard. So, in conclusion, in an attempt to reduce the numbers of eating disorders that we are seeing today, the U.S. needs to regulate these advertisements in order to shrink the amount of body dissatisfaction produced, directly shrinking the numbers of eating disorders we are seeing. Thank you. Questions?
I greatly appreciated your presentation. I thought it was really well done. And I think it's been a problem forever, for a long, long, long time. And but how, in your research, how did you find out, or what was the research behind that these are manipulated images of people? Did they say that, or what kind of research and study did you do to find that advertisements were being manipulated by the body shapes of the models?
Okay, so I can't remember exactly what sources it was, but I did come across several sources that showed that the companies use things such as Photoshop to change the body shapes, and it wasn't like a huge change, but it was change enough to cause these effects.
Okay, I'm cheating a little bit because I read your paper too. But you mentioned in the paper that other countries do regulate these advertisements. I would imagine regulating advertisements is incredibly time consuming, just with the number of ads and images that are out there. How do you think we should actually do this if it was to come to pass?
Okay, yeah. So with other countries, if we look at the UK, they were facing really bad eating disorder rates, that similar to what we are facing now, but relative to their population. And so they took action in 1988, and they actually started regulating their advertisements. They have this one thing, I can't remember what like the full name is, but it's called the ASA, and they actually have a list of like guidelines and rules that regulate the advertisements, and they saw a direct decrease in eating disorder rates. And so the Federal Trade Commission in the U.S., they already regulate some advertisements that are deemed misleading, and so we would just craft a guideline similar to what they have for other products and other advertisements, and then follow in those footsteps.
Good job, Ms. Glaze. I'm going to ping pong off of that question. And so you just took a glancing blow at it too. So what percentage of the eating disorders decreased in the UK after they started regulating?
I cannot remember the exact number that it was, but I think it was around, I want to say 9%. And I know that the population sizes differ greatly. I don't know what percent of their population is currently struggling, but I do know that the amount of eating disorders they have has dropped down to 1 million.
Yeah. Did they isolate that as the causal factor, or were there other factors? In other words, education or some other things?
Cause.
That was the causal
Yes.
factor. Okay. You talked about your social comparison theory. Okay. So if that theory is true, how come there's not more issues with eating disorders, and how come males aren't affected?
Males are affected by eating disorders, for sure. But it is the majority women. It is over 50% women, so I focus mostly on women and their advertisements, but it is also an effect in the men's advertising because men also suffer from eating disorders.
So I guess to hone in on that question, if the theory is true, how come everybody's not affected? In other words, if we all are subject to social comparison, right, everybody, universally, how come universally we don't all suffer from eating disorders if there's this gap?
Well, everyone for sure is affected by the social comparison theory. I guarantee, like, everyone in this room has felt something along the lines of, like, shame when eating a large amount, or just things along the lines of, like, disordered eating habits. But it comes down to, there's multiple factors that can go into developing an eating disorder, but there is just a large amount of eating disorders that, if that standard wasn't there causing that body dissatisfaction, then that amount would not have been caused.
That's what I wanted you to go toward. There are other factors. This is the main one, but genetics, childhood trauma, abuse, blah, 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 all these play a role. All right, good
Yes,
job.
there's many causes.
Thanks.
So this is probably just a final follow-up to that question, because you had said that that body dissatisfaction, that the highest percentage is caused by everything that was in your presentation, but the highest percentage, and there were others. How much of a difference, how much is, in terms of the statistics and the research that you did, what percentage, if this was the top of the list, what percentage is that compared to the other reasons for body dissatisfaction?
So I actually don't know the proportional statistics. I just know that it's the leading cause.
Okay. I'm just trying to understand, is it so much greater than the other causes that you know this is really the one that needs the most attention? Because I know your heart is for trying to address the issue. Again, I'm the numbers person, so I'm thinking, well, if this one is about the same as three others, are there other things that we could be doing that could be more effective initially?
Yeah, well, the other causes are things such as, like, genetics and, like you said, childhood trauma and stuff like that. And so those are really hard to target and to fix. And so with this one being the main cause and having an approach to fix it, even if it was just 1%, with 30 million diagnosed eating disorders, that 1% is definitely an interest.
Okay. You know, and you also made a good point, and I appreciate, you talked about there are other things that we see in terms of, like, blemishes are removed, or hair is a certain way, or makeup is perfect. And so if you were to try to really get this enacted, it seems like you're going to get a lot of pushback from advertisers and from companies saying, wait a minute, you can't do this and then let somebody else do that. So how can you make the case that this one specific area really needs to be targeted, but the others will let alone?
So if a company would try to argue that, I'd bring up a case of this one store called Aerie. It's a sister store of American Eagle. So they stopped digitally altering their models' body shapes and sizes. However, they kept things such as, like, removing blemishes, and they actually saw a direct increase of a 20% sales revenue profit, whereas their competitor, Victoria's Secret, continued to alter their advertisements, and they actually saw a decrease.
And then I have a question about disclaimers. Because you made the comment that it wouldn't be real effective, that studies have shown that a disclaimer might actually aggravate the problem. So I'm thinking about cigarettes or alcohol, and there's certainly disclaimers. I don't buy cigarettes, but, I'm assuming that there are. It seems like those disclaimers probably haven't increased the sales of cigarettes or alcohol. So I'm not questioning. I'm just a little surprised by your research on that point, because I certainly see other places like those examples where disclaimers are used, and there's no argument that they shouldn't be.
Yeah, so I did not research things such as cigarettes, so I don't know, like, the effects of that. But I did see in multiple journals that I read that the boomerang effect actually worsened body dissatisfaction, so I didn't look into other things such as cigarettes, because it was kind of a different market than beauty advertisements.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Mandy. So we will have one more presentation before our lunch break, and it'll begin at 10:15, or 10:30. Sorry, yes, 10:30. We can do that last one a little bit quicker so you have more time to take a break and do what you need to do.